Do you remember bubblegum cigarettes? Whatever happened to those? You see, I was a 90s kid. I know, I was adorable. And as soon as I started earning an allowance, I remember riding my little Huffy bike down to the gas station to buy them with my friends. That way we could pretend to smoke over a decade before we were legally allowed to. But then they just sort of disappeared, and I never really understood why. So let's answer that question today. Whatever happened to the bubblegum cigarette?
Really? That's the question you're going with? That's pretty lame compared to your last video.
I know, but it's really hard to come up with something to follow that. You can't do that in here!
Why not? I thought this was America.
Oh God, you're a libertarian.
Well, yeah, but I don't see what that has to do with anything. I know the risks. I'm free to make my own choices regarding my health. It's called self-determination. Look it up. You were a teenager in the 2000s. Didn't you see that South Park episode? Or that one Penn and Teller show?
Huh. Yeah, I should probably talk about that. I guess I never really thought about how comedy shaped the discussion around cigarettes when I was growing up. Yeah, you know what? That's a much better question.
What? Why you hate America?
No. How did the cigarette become a libertarian symbol of individual liberty and personal responsibility? And also the bubblegum thing, I'm curious. This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula.
You couldn't afford a better TV?
I know, people were complaining about that, but I'm trying to go with a whole retro VHS look.
Well, at least make a better connection.
Better connection? It's a built-in DVD player. Could you stop messing with stuff? I'm trying to make a video here.
Huh. You see when this thing was made?
Put that thing out, you look ridiculous.
Ridiculous? Please, you wish you could look this cool.
I look plenty cool.
You're wearing cargo shorts.
Oh, now you're giving me fashion advice?
You need fashion advice.
As much as I wish I could tell this story from a personal perspective, cigarettes were already a ubiquitous part of American society by the time I came around, so we'll have to pick someone else for now. Rose Cipollone was born in December 1925 and picked up her first pack of Chesterfields at the age of 16. At the time she began smoking, the health risks associated with cigarettes weren't really known because, believe it or not, cigarettes were a relatively recent invention. Several other things had to fall into place before these death sticks could pop into existence. American Indians had been using tobacco for ritual and medicinal purposes for over 1,000 years before European contact. But the way they used tobacco was very different from the way we do. To use a ceremonial peace pipe, they would draw the smoke into their mouths and then ritually blow it in each other's faces. They never inhaled it into their lungs like you would with a cigarette. Because back in the day, the nicotine content in tobacco was so strong, it was basically a hallucinogen. Much like caffeine, nicotine is a natural insecticide found within the leaves of the tobacco plant. A single drop of the pure stuff will kill you, but in lower doses it causes euphoria. The active ingredient in cigarettes is itself a poison, but you already knew that. I'm not here to preach. Europeans learned how to smoke tobacco during Columbus's first journey in 1492. They brought the practice back to Spain, and it quickly spread across the continent. Through its colonies in the New World, the Spanish would have a near monopoly on the tobacco trade in Europe for the next century. Then, an extremely important event in the history of tobacco, Britain, and the future United States occurred: the Anglo-Spanish War. This was when the Spanish Armada was destroyed and Britain began to dominate the seas, with an eye towards creating their own colonies. Almost immediately after making peace with Spain in 1604, King James I of England wrote an anti-tobacco screed, appropriately titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, calling it
a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lung, and in the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembles the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless.
Which is hell. He's talking about hell. It's tempting to think that he was centuries ahead of the science on this, but Mostly he was just annoyed that his subjects were buying a noxious foreign weed and placed a 4,000% tax on all imports, which began the search for a domestic supply of tobacco. In 1607, Jamestown, Virginia was founded as a British colony in the New World, and a few years later, John Rolfe showed up with a shipment of tobacco seeds. That's right, this is another video about Jamestown. It's all coming together now.
The first successful commercial crop of tobacco was cultivated in Virginia in 1612. Within 7 years, it was one of the country's largest exports.
So, tobacco helped to build America.
That's right.
Within 7 years, huh? Well, 1612 plus 7 is 6.
The tobacco business was so great that many slaves were brought from Africa to help work the fields.
Which means if it weren't for tobacco, many of our black friends wouldn't be here today.
I'm still trying to figure out why this stupid TV keeps cutting to random clips. At least it's not PragerU this time, right? Anyway, if you followed the math there, South Park just agreed with the same timeline as the 1619 project. This wasn't always controversial, it was an accepted historical fact. Slavery existed in America at least a year before the Pilgrims landed, which is still a story for another time. I promise I'll get to it. Within a few decades, slaves made up the majority of the labor force in tobacco, the colonies were exporting 20 million pounds a year, and half of British men were smoking on a daily basis. Though at this point, cigars and pipes were still their only options. In 1758, the Seville tobacco factory opened in Spain and became the most prominent producer of cigars and snuff in Europe. Cigars are made out of whole leaf tobacco and were too expensive for workers to consume themselves, so they often took the leftover scraps, rolled them in paper, and called them cigarettes. They were viewed as a lower class form of tobacco, something you only did if you couldn't afford the real thing. And it's important to remember, these are still not the cigarettes we know today. Inhaling the smoke from one of these would send you on a vision quest, which was generally seen as an undesirable experience. You simply drew the smoke into your mouth, enjoyed the taste for a second, and released it. You'd still get a buzz from doing that, but you wouldn't lose your mind. Unlike their European counterparts, Americans seemed much more fond of using chewing tobacco, which involved placing long-cut tobacco leaves between the lip and gum. Snuff, dip, and snooze are basically the same thing, but cut and packaged slightly differently. For our purposes, they're all chew. It was so popular in America that during a trip to Washington, D.C. in 1842, Charles Dickens referred to the Capitol as the headquarters of tobacco-tinctured saliva. Spittoons were an expected feature in every business establishment. In 1864, burley leaf tobacco was bred west of the Appalachians. This new strain was lighter in flavor and less acidic than traditional Virginia tobacco. Combined with a new flu-curing technique, tobacco smoke was finally mild enough to be inhaled into the lungs. Prior to this, it was physically impossible to become addicted to nicotine because you couldn't get enough of it into your body. Tobacco smoke was simply too harsh. James Duke began manufacturing cigarettes in Durham, North Carolina in 1879. Before you ask, he had the university named after his father. He employed 10 female workers who rolled each individual cigarette by hand. An experienced roller could produce 200 cigarettes an hour. It was an extremely labor-intensive product with a very slim profit margin. Nobody in the wider tobacco industry thought that cigarettes would ever catch on. Most dismissed them as a fad for poor people.
But I'm afraid I don't believe in cigarettes, much less a machine for making them. It turns my stomach, sir, every time I have occasion to witness someone poking one of those vile concoctions into their face.
In 1880, James Bonsack invented the first successful cigarette rolling machine, capable of producing 200 cigarettes a minute. But nobody in the wider industry would take a chance on him until he crossed paths with James Duke. Isn't it weird that everyone involved in this story so far is named James? Their partnership was dramatized in the 1950 movie Brightleaf, starring Gary Cooper.
Doesn't seem possible, but I think you're trying to sell something.
Yes, sir. A machine for manufacturing cigarettes.
Now, wait a minute. You mean you got a machine that'll roll cigarettes, put the paper on them?
And package them too, all in the same operation.
By 1886, Duke had entered into an exclusive agreement with Bonsack to have all of his cigarettes manufactured on 10 rolling machines, rather than by hand. The industry was still averse to cigarettes, especially ones manufactured by machine, and newspapers warned they would cause the downfall of American society.
The decadence of Spain began when the Spaniards adopted cigarettes, and if this pernicious practice obtains among adult Americans, the ruin of the Republic is close at hand.
Now, you might think all all the necessary pieces are on the board. We bred a lighter tobacco, found a cleaner way to cure it, and invented a way to cheaply mass produce them. But how are you supposed to light one of these things? Fancy cigar rooms would usually have a burning lamp or candle available for you to light up whenever you wanted. But these things are designed to be smoked out and about. You need a portable solution. Handheld lighters weren't a thing yet. Petroleum products like butane and kerosene wouldn't exist for another decade, and nobody was using whale oil to light cigarettes. So okay, a match. When do you think matches were invented? While the first friction match was created in 1826, it used toxic phosphorus. If you were to light a cigarette with one of those, it would be your last cigarette. The first non-toxic matchbook wasn't introduced to the market until 1898. Cigarettes are one of those things that I've always assumed have existed in some form since basically the beginning of time. But in reality, they've only been around for like a century. During James Duke's first full year of cigarette production in 1880, Americans smoked an average of 50 cigarettes per person per year. Less than 100 years later, that would rise to 4,100 per person per year. When I started working on this video, I wanted to just focus on the marketing side of how that happened, while mostly skipping over the science and politics. But the more I researched this topic, the more I realized that all of those things are inextricably linked. I'm not going to beat you over the head with the science of how cigarettes are bad for you. You know they're bad for you. But I am going to talk about how the industry convinced us to ignore that fact and do it anyway. Thanks to the bond sack machines, Duke's American Tobacco Company was producing millions more cigarettes than he could sell. Plastic packaging wasn't a thing yet, so cigarettes had a very limited shelf life before they went stale, and he wasn't moving his product fast enough. So he needed to create customers, and many of the techniques he developed helped shape the modern advertising industry. Duke had 400,000 branded chairs made and sent to retail stores, not to be sold to consumers, but to be used as furniture. And not so subtle advertising. He gave out branded matchbooks for free so people could easily light up his product. Then he installed a print shop in his factory to produce collectible trading cards which were included in every pack, featuring famous landmarks, Civil War generals, athletes, scantily clad actresses, and women from far-off exotic places. This is the origin of baseball cards, trading cards, and eventually Pokemon. As you can imagine, these cards were especially popular among boys and young men, who were encouraged to literally collect them all. Getting a full set would require you to smoke over 12,000 cigarettes. Very little has changed in the collectibles industry. He also included coupons in every pack that could be saved up to buy premiums, which were all sorts of exciting things.
Surprise!
Binoculars! Oh, but honey, you shouldn't have spent the money.
Oh, don't get excited. Didn't cost a penny. Free for Raleigh coupons.
So you too save Raleigh coupons.
Indeed we do.
Boy, this new grill sure does the job.
Too bad we couldn't get the steaks for Raleigh coupons too.
Don't be greedy, darling. After all, we did get the grill and the thermos jug. This Westinghouse toaster is a Raleigh premium. Those coupons mount up fast.
This wasn't just limited to kitchen appliances. Brands continuously tried to one-up each other and offer better and better premiums.
How would you like this pedigreed St. Bernard pup free? He's one of hundreds of gifts you get from Alpine cigarettes, with the new dividend coupons now on every pack of Alpines. Hey, good idea. Buy Alpine by the carton and get 4 extra coupons.
I know those commercials were from the 1960s, but this whole scheme was started by James Duke over 100 years ago. By the way, that St. Bernard cost 18,830 coupons. If you only ever bought the cartons for those extra 4, you would have spent $5,380, and you'd have stockpiled over 250,000 cigarettes. If you smoked a pack a day, it would take you almost 37 years to get through them all. Are you a member of a grocery store or have a credit card where you accumulate points or travel miles? Well, tobacco was one of the first industries to have a loyalty program like that. In fact, you're gonna find that the cigarette is responsible for a lot of our modern culture. We're barely getting started. By the turn of the century, cigarettes only accounted for 2% of all tobacco consumption in the US. Chew was still by far the most dominant form of tobacco at 48%, followed by cigars, pipes, and snuff. It would take another few decades for cigarettes to catch on. In 1890, Duke's American Tobacco conglomerated with 4 other companies to form the Tobacco Trust, which collectively controlled 75 to 85% of the tobacco market. The Sherman Antitrust Act was signed into law just 6 months later. Whenever we talk about trust busting in American history, we almost always focus on Rockefeller's Standard Oil, but this was happening in just about every industry. Milton Hershey was trying to form a food conglomerate known as the Quality Products Corporation. But on the same day the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, they also dissolved the Tobacco Trust into 4 companies, hoping to promote competition. Instead of lowering prices, this resulted in an explosion of advertising as brands fought over market share. R.J. Reynolds introduced Camels in 1913. They created a blended cigarette by combining white burley leaf with a sprig of Turkish tobacco, making it one of the first luxury brands. In response, American Tobacco introduced Lucky Strikes 3 years later. I know if I don't bring this up, half the comments will be asking about it, so let's get this out of the way.
But everybody else's tobacco's toasted.
No, everybody else's tobacco is poisonous. Lucky Strikes is toasted.
Yeah, that's not how it happened. Lucky Strike was using "They're Toasted" as their slogan pretty much as soon as they were introduced. The new president of American Tobacco came up with it while watching the curing process. They didn't need to hire a fancy ad agency. That was invented for the TV show. Sorry for ruining the magic. The first big bump in cigarette consumption came during World War I, when the US War Department began issuing tobacco rations to soldiers and sailors. Service members received 4 cigarettes, or 4/10 of an ounce of loose tobacco, every day. This was right in the middle of the temperance movement, so many people, including Henry Ford, were vocally opposed to the normalization of smoking. And they were quickly silenced by soldiers in the trenches who reported that cigarettes calmed their nerves and provided a brief moment of solace. Prohibition began in 1920, and cigarettes quickly assumed many of the social and leisure roles that had been previously satisfied by alcohol. Americans were now smoking 500 cigarettes per person per year. Now that men were beginning to switch to cigarettes, American Tobacco began marketing Lucky Strikes to women, which was an uphill battle considering female smoking was even more stigmatized.
It degrades everything in a woman that is worthwhile, making the lovely, devoted, clean wife and mother negligent of all her womanly duties and responsibilities.
I know what you're going to say. Only fast women smoke, but that's not true anymore, so you needn't start yelling at me. Everybody's doing it, so why shouldn't I? It's getting to be very fashionable.
This video is going to take forever if you keep cutting to stuff. I swear that thing has a mind of its own. To combat that cultural perception, American Tobacco hired Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, who pioneered numerous psychological methods to change the way society viewed cigarettes. Perhaps the most sinister of these concepts was the created event. This was a staged public spectacle specifically designed to generate news coverage, which served as free advertising with the added benefit of appearing neutral. It wasn't the tobacco companies saying it, it was your trustworthy local newspaper. By far, the most famous of these created events occurred during the 1929 Easter Parade in New York City. Riding the coattails of the suffragette movement, Bernays sponsored a float loaded with female smokers, who urged other women to fight another sex taboo, light another torch of freedom. His plan worked. The controversy spread through the media and turned cigarettes into a symbol of female empowerment. Rather quickly, another problem emerged. Women were choosing cigarette brands based on how the packaging matched with their various outfits. Packs of Lucky Strikes were green, which wasn't really a trendy color. Rather than redesign the packaging, Bernays colluded with the fashion industry to hold charity balls where celebrities had to wear green in order to make it more popular with the public. This is where seasonal fashion trends like orange is the new pink come from. Who do you think chooses those colors? To capitalize on women's concerns over their figures, Bernays realized he could market cigarettes as a dietary aid. And there is actually some truth to that. Nicotine is a well-known appetite suppressant. American Tobacco began using the slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet." And he again worked with the fashion industry to reshape our modern definition of beauty, insisting that the slim woman is the ideal American type.
The slender, modish saleswoman is in demand and can earn more for herself and her employer than her heavier sisters.
He then wrote anonymous letters to Hollywood directors telling them how they could use cigarettes to portray just about anything: nervousness, confidence, weakness, strength, celebration, and even defeat. You could open a scene on a couple smoking in bed, and everyone would know what just happened without you having to say it. As they began the shift from silent films to talkies, the cigarette retained its position as one of the most widely used props and perhaps the earliest example of product placement. By the end of World War II, 48% of American men were smoking regularly, along with 36% of women, which included Rose Cipollone, who bought her first pack of cigarettes in 1942. Did you forget about her? That's who this video is about. The marketing strategies employed by Edward Bernays catapulted cigarettes to the leading form of tobacco consumption by the 1950s, accounting for 81% of the market. Americans were smoking 2,500 cigarettes per person per year. The spittoon had been replaced by the ashtray. As I said, that first batch of Americans didn't start smoking until the 1920s, and it takes decades for cancer to develop. So the biggest concern at the time was throat irritation or smoker's cough, which was thought to be a temporary annoyance rather than a harbinger of things to come. The first attempt to solve this problem came in 1925, when the first mentholated cigarette was patented and sold under the brand name Spud. Most Americans were pretty familiar with menthol at this point. It was a staple item in every medicine cabinet and used as a pain reliever, antiseptic, and treatment for coughs, colds, flus, rashes, you name it. It's the active ingredient in Vicks VapoRub, which was introduced in 1905. Menthol is primarily extracted from the peppermint plant, and its defining characteristic is that cool, fresh sensation you feel when it's applied to the skin or inhaled. It's often sold as a way to open up your airways. So when Spud hit the market, consumers didn't just view them as having a minty flavor, but considered them to be a medicated cigarette. Spud even advertised them as having a lower temperature smoke than their competitors, going so far as to call it air-conditioned.
Look into my eyes. I'm going to hypnotize you. Yes, you. Right now. No, don't look away. Look into my eyes. You want to smoke? You want a smoke that will make your mouth taste fresh? There is such a smoke. It's called Spud. New Spud. It's new.
It's new.
It has a light touch of menthol that freshens the smoke. Something wonderful. New Spud by the makers of Marlboro. It has a fresh taste like it was air-conditioned. You're going to try new Spud tomorrow. You're going to try new Spud. You're going to buy a pack tomorrow.
Tomorrow. New Spud. Bruh, are you alright? What did I tell you about smoking in here? Okay, first of all, I don't see a sign anywhere. Second, it kind of seemed like an emergency. You've been sitting there mumbling to yourself for hours. The fuck? That wouldn't happen to be a menthol, would it? Ha! No, I'm not. You know who smokes menthols. What? No, actually, I don't know who smokes menthols. Why don't you tell us, and make sure to say it loud enough for the camera? That stereotype doesn't come along until much later, but we'll get to that. When they were introduced, menthols made up just 2% of the market. They were seen as a novelty cigarette, something people smoked between other cigarettes to freshen their breath. But it didn't take long for other companies to realize the marketing value of selling a cooler, milder cigarette. Cools were introduced by Brown and Williamson in 1933 and were advertised using a cartoon mascot named Willie the Penguin. It was at this point that scientists actually began looking into the effects of menthol on the body, and while it should be obvious to everyone that it doesn't physically lower the temperature of cigarette smoke, they also found that it doesn't do much of anything else either. Menthol doesn't open up your airways or protect against throat irritation. If you were to use a microscope to look at the cells of someone who just smoked a menthol and compared them to someone who smoked a regular cigarette, you wouldn't see any difference. What if I told you that the cool minty sensation is just an illusion created by your brain? It's a lot like taking over-the-counter pain medication. it doesn't actually treat the cause of your pain, it just dulls your perception of it, which is fine if you have a headache or you're recovering from an injury. But if you're taking it before going to work so you can stand around for 8 hours and continue to do that repetitive motion, you're just causing more damage to yourself, which is exactly what mentholated cigarettes encouraged. Since menthol masks the irritation caused by inhaling burning leaves, people who use menthol cigarettes end up smoking way more than those who don't. And since it was widely viewed as a milder smoke, menthols quickly became the entry cigarette for most first-time smokers. And when I say first-time smokers, I'm talking about kids, who flock to Kool because of their cartoon animal mascot. This will be a recurring theme. Kool would overtake Spud in sales by 1937 because of that appeal. While the general public thought of menthol as a drug, the medical community viewed it as being mostly inert, so politicians didn't even consider regulating it. Tobacco companies were more than happy to continue selling menthol as a flavor. But not everyone likes the taste of menthol, and they still wanted a smoother, milder smoke. So in 1937, the first king-size cigarettes were introduced.
Yes, Dunhill, thanks to its king size, its finer tobaccos, and its natural filtering qualities, screens out irritants to give you a far milder smoke.
Pall-Mall's famous length travels the smoke naturally, over, under, around, and through the finest tobaccos money can buy, and makes it mild.
What? He's gonna come back, so I might as well be prepared.
You may be wondering how a king-size cigarette would produce a milder smoke. If it's bigger, you would think it would be stronger, right? But it's actually the same amount of tobacco, just more loosely packed, allowing more air to flow through. Companies specifically marketed king-size cigarettes for their ability to filter out irritants and air soften every puff.
Nothing satisfies like the big, clean taste of top tobacco in Chesterfield King. The farther smoke travels, the milder it tastes. The farther smoke travels, the cooler it tastes. The farther smoke travels, the smoother it tastes. And today, only Chesterfield. Air softens the big, clean taste of top tobacco end to end with new top porosity paper. No wonder nothing satisfies like Chesterfield King. Chesterfield! They satisfy.
You're right, that is the brand Rose Cipollone began smoking when she was 16. I'm glad you're paying attention. Chesterfield wasn't the only brand to experiment with different kinds of paper that supposedly produced a cleaner, more refreshing smoke.
Salem brings you springtime refreshment. For Salem special paper, air softens every puff.
You can smoke for pleasure today. No cigarette hangover tomorrow. That is the big advantage you enjoy in Philip Morris. Remember, Philip Morris is made differently from any other leading brand. And that difference is your guarantee of everything you've ever wanted in a cigarette.
In 1933, Philip Morris introduced their new Philip Morris brand cigarettes, promoting them using a bellboy mascot named Johnny Morris. They began using diethylene glycol as a moistening agent in their casing, claiming it was less irritating than any other leading brand. You may recognize diethylene glycol as the main ingredient in antifreeze. A few years later, a drug named elixir sulfanilamide, which was sold as an over-the-counter antibiotic, also used it as an ingredient and ended up killing over 100 people. As a result of this disaster, Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. This gave the Federal Trade Commission the authority to regulate claims on food, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and cosmetics. But curiously, not tobacco. Because of that loophole, cigarette manufacturers continued to use diethylene glycol for decades. At this point, just about every brand was using some sort of marketing gimmick to claim that their cigarettes were somehow healthier. But the one you've probably all been waiting for me to talk about is Camel.
Camels are so mild that in a recent test of hundreds of people who smoked only Camels for 30 consecutive days, noted throat specialists making weekly examinations reported not one single case of throat irritation due to smoking Camels.
Since they hit the market, Camels had a reputation as the truck driver's cigarette, and they desperately wanted to change that perception. In 1934, an article in Science magazine stated that smoking a cigarette temporarily increased your blood sugar levels, and Camel immediately latched onto that result. They made ads promising customers that they would get a lift by smoking their brand, and it worked. They soon realized that appealing to science and the medical profession would help them expand into the female and middle class markets, and it didn't take long for them to jump into the deep end.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
The brand named most was Camel. Yes, surveys show more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
Fun fact about that survey, it was conducted during a convention of the American Medical Association, where Camel handed out free packs of cigarettes to every doctor in attendance. Later that day, a pollster asked them what brand of cigarettes they were carrying around in their pocket. More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette, exploited people's faith in modern medicine, and was used as their slogan from 1946 to 1952, when Cancer by the Carton was published. You see, enough time had finally passed for the 1920s generation of smokers to begin developing lung cancer. The medical community started to notice an anecdotal link, and a few large-scale studies had been done in the United States and Britain demonstrating that correlation. Reader's Digest took those findings and translated the scientific jargon into a language everyone could understand. Now, I said I wasn't going to beat you over the head with the science on this, but I didn't say anything about having someone else do it.
The Reader's Digest article made the problem clear. The increase in lung cancer mortality shows a suspicious parallel to the enormous increase in cigarette consumption. The article quotes a recent study that showed that the incidence of death by lung cancer had increased more than 10 times from 1920 to 1948. And while it's true that the deaths correlated with increased smoking rates, correlation isn't causation, so why were scientists so confident in a causal link? Well, throughout the early 20th century, epidemiologists conducted case control studies to figure out why lung cancer rates were rising. They'd recruit people with cancer, the case, then recruit similar people without cancer, the control. Then they'd try to find any differences between the two groups, usually by giving them questionnaires about their lifestyle or medical history. The idea there is that any difference on the questionnaire might show why one group developed cancer while the other didn't. And by the 1920s and 30s, epidemiologists were already starting to notice that the participants with cancer tended to be smokers more often than their controls. But these studies didn't really affect popular opinion or policy. But in 1950, 4 studies came out that provided the best evidence up to that point that smoking causes lung cancer. 2 were back-to-back articles in the May issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association. One of them is actually referenced in the Digest piece, the one by Winder and Graham. Another study came out in Cancer Research, and the 4th in the British Medical Journal in September. Not only did these studies each recruit hundreds or thousands of people, some of them showed something called a dose-response effect, which is when increased exposure to the bad thing lines up with increased or decreased rates of disease. So in this case, the groups that smoked more cigarettes had the highest rates of lung cancer, while the groups that smoked less cigarettes had less lung cancer. Plus, the dose-response effect is easy to translate to a lay audience. The more you smoke, the greater your risk of developing lung cancer. This Reader's Digest article marked a turning point in public education about smoking and lung cancer. But as far as research that impacted policy, we'd have to wait until 1954, when a massive study of British doctors came out and rocked the medical community.
Okay, so that video by Patrick Kelly is like 25 minutes long, so I won't show it all here. The link is down below, and it's crazy interesting. Think about it. How do you prove that cigarettes cause lung cancer and not something like driving cars or working in factories? He goes over the entire scientific history of how they proved the link, and even developed meta-analyses to show.
Do you remember 1952?
Well, sir, I wasn't alive in 1952.
1952 was a year Reader's Digest nailed us with the whole health aspect.
What the? Fine, back on topic, I guess. I really can't stress enough how important that article was in the history of tobacco. A year after it came out, industry CEOs got together to develop a unified public relations campaign to fight the ever-growing body of scientific evidence. It's at this point that we can start calling them Big Tobacco, because now they were working collectively. The result of that meeting was a frank statement to cigarette smokers, printed in 448 newspapers across 258 cities. It calls the link between cigarettes and lung cancer a theory and dismisses all the research done up to that point as inconclusive or inadequate. The industry pledged to work with scientists and called for more research, while simultaneously continuing to push the no-proof narrative for decades, a tactic which would later be borrowed by several other industries. The statement also announced the creation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, otherwise known as TURC. It was sold to the public as a scientific group that would independently investigate the health effects of smoking. But in reality, it was controlled by a PR firm hired by Big Tobacco. The firm's unofficial motto was "Doubt is our product." Within a few months, they produced a paper titled A Scientific Perspective on the Cigarette Controversy, which contained 18 pages of quotes from scientists and doctors who were skeptical of the cancer link. Whenever there was a new scientific finding, Turk would wave that around as a way to say, "Look at all the people who disagree." And anytime a news organization began working on a story about cigarettes and cancer, Big Tobacco would make sure that one of their scientists was quoted in the article or included in the televised debate. Regardless of the overall message, the fact that the controversy was given a voice at all was a win for the industry. At this point, Rose Cipollone was smoking a pack a day. She tried to quit during her pregnancy a few years earlier, but could only manage to cut back by a little. Following cancer by the carton, Rose, like many smokers, began to look for a healthier, safer cigarette. Luckily, the tobacco industry already had experience in dealing with this problem. Both menthol and king-size cigarettes were marketed using a health reassurance angle. Words like smooth, mild, clean, cool, and fresh all imply that these cigarettes are better for you. The use of doctors and the fancy new world of science were more overt attempts to convince people that cigarettes were healthy and safe. And Camel was not alone in doing that.
A group of people smoked only Chesterfields for 6 months in their normal amount, 10 to 40 a day. After a thorough examination of every member of the group, the medical specialist stated, "It is my opinion that the ears, nose, throat, and accessory organs of all participating subjects examined by me were not adversely affected in the 6 months period by smoking the cigarettes provided." Remember this report and buy Chesterfields. How does Accuray make Chesterfield a better cigarette than was ever possible before?
Every cigarette made with Accuray control contains a more precise measure of perfectly packed tobaccos, so Chesterfield smokes smoother, without hot spots or a hard draw.
That's why Chesterfield tastes better and is best for you.
The Accuray technology being peddled by Chesterfield wasn't enough to reduce Rose Cipollone's fears, so in 1955, she switched to the new filtered L&Ms.
Now, L&M is king size as well as regular. Both have the same low price, both have the miracle tip for the effective filtration you need. Yes, it's the filter that counts, and L&M has the best. You get much more flavor, much less nicotine, a light and mild smoke. This is it. L&M filters, just what the doctor ordered.
Just what the doctor ordered. The first filtered cigarettes were introduced in the 1930s, but they didn't really catch on. When the Reader's Digest article was published, they accounted for less than 1% of all sales. King-size cigarettes still dominated the market at 27%, and menthols only took up 5%. But as the fear of cancer gripped the nation in the 50s, over half of all smokers, including Rose, made the switch to filters, and by 1960, they took up 51% of the market. It had become obvious to Big Tobacco that this was the future of cigarettes.
Yes, the perfect marriage between a great new filter and a great modern blend. Now, in new Old Gold Filter Kings.
I'll take this Raleigh filter every time. I don't see why everybody doesn't smoke Raleighs.
Get a load of this filter. Hey, you can actually taste the tobacco through the new Spud filter.
Now you can have famous Camel quality in new Camel filters, too.
Camel filters have a real taste, too. Camel filters have a real
Yes, that is the guy from Jaws.
Camel filter cigarettes.
We're gonna need a bigger filter.
You get refreshing menthol and you get the longest filter offered yet. It's Alpine, Alpine, Alpine.
Filtered menthols quickly became popular across all races and genders. 30% of all cigarettes sold at the time featured this combination. The market had become so saturated with filtered cigarettes that some companies developed gimmick filters to help them stand out from the crowd.
In this fancy, frilly, you gotta have a gimmick world,
there's one cigarette that doesn't go along.
Camel filters?
We're not about to hide our kind of easy taste behind some gimmick. Camel filters, they're not for everybody. But then, they don't try to be.
Why would you pick that one? I'm trying to tell them about gimmick filters and you pick the one brand that specifically does...
Lark is unique in cigarette filtration. Only in the Keith filter do you find two modern outer filters plus an inner filter of charcoal granules. Cork tips to protect your lips.
Tarryton's got a charcoal tip, and it's got a white one too. You feel better about smoking with the taste of Kent with the Micronite filter.
Micronite filters were made out of asbestos, which gave people mesothelioma. So within a few years, Kent, and the industry as a whole, switched to cellulose acetate, which they still use to this day. In 1972, Rose Cipollone began smoking Parliaments, which had a rather unique filter gimmick. Before I show you this commercial, I should warn you, it has a rather gratuitous sex scene by 1950s standards, but we're all adults here.
New Parliament keeps what it filters off your lips.
No filter feedback.
Keeps it off your lips and her lips too.
No filter feedback.
Tobacco tastes best when the filter's recessed. Parliament, smoke Parliament cigarette. No filter feedback.
Someday, all filters will be made this better way, recessed like today's Parliament. Because filters that are flush, like this, feed back nicotine and tar. But with Parliament's exclusive recessed filter, you smoke clean. The United States Testing Company confirms high filtration, no filter feedback. On your lips or hers.
Tobacco tastes best when the filter's recessed. Parliament, smoke Parliament cigarette.
No filter feedback.
Yeah, that song is catchy as hell. Good luck getting that out of your head. It's funny that they thought every cigarette would eventually be made like that. I can't imagine having an extra quarter-inch of paper on the end would create a very fun mouthfeel. But there's something else about these filters that I think everyone needs to know.
Your cigarette's not tasting cool enough till you come up to cool. With rich tobacco's cool white filter, extra coolness too.
As soon as filters were added to every cigarette, Big Tobacco realized that they're actually useless. They don't filter out anything. So they began altering the pH of the filter material itself so that when you smoked it, that cool white filter would change color to yellow, giving you the impression that they're doing something. Here's how one researcher at R.J. Reynolds put it when he originally pitched the idea.
The cigarette smoking public attaches great significance to visual examination of the filter material in filter tip cigarettes after smoking the cigarettes. A before and after smoking visual comparison is usually made, and if the filter tip material is darkened after smoking, the tip is automatically judged to be effective. While the use of such color change material would probably have little to no effect on the actual efficiency of the filter tip material, the advertising and sales advantages are obvious.
Philip Morris would likewise conclude that the illusion of filtration is as important as the fact of filtration. In 1955, the FTC issued voluntary guidelines urging tobacco companies to avoid making explicit health claims about their products and to stop using testimonials from doctors and scientists. But the damage was done. People had already convinced themselves that filters made cigarettes healthier. Filtered cigarettes made up 90% of the market in the 70s, and their perception as being safer allowed Americans to justify smoking even more than they had previously. By 1974, consumption had increased to 4,100 per person per year. That's 11 cigarettes for every man, woman, and child. This was the peak of smoking in the United States. Half of all adults were lighting up regularly thanks to tobacco's aggressive marketing campaigns on radio and television, which probably wouldn't have existed without cigarettes in the first place. When commercial radio began in the 1920s, broadcasters like NBC, ABC, and CBS operated more like YouTube and Facebook today. They didn't actually create any content. They were just a platform. The shows themselves were produced by advertisers, or in this case, tobacco companies. Beginning in 1935, Lucky Strikes produced a musical variety show titled Your Hit Parade, which played a ranked list of top songs chosen by National Survey. This is the predecessor to the American Top 40, or even Total Request Live. When broadcast television began in 1946, things worked in much the same way. Advertisers produced the programs and then paid to have them shown on the air. I Love Lucy was not a CBS show sponsored by Philip Morris. It was a Philip Morris show that happened to air on CBS. They dictated everything about the content, including the story and how often their product was mentioned or featured.
How about a good night cigarette, Ricky?
Thank you, Lucy. Nothing but the best, huh?
Natch, nothing but Philip Morris.
Just about every TV show worked this way. Dragnet was produced by Rose Cipolloni's first brand.
Friends, as you know, on Dragnet, we've always tried to emphasize the importance of facts. And when we talk to you about Chesterfield, we give you the facts.
The game show I've Got a Secret was created by Winston, the same brand behind The Flintstones, which was an adult-oriented cartoon in the same genre as The Simpsons and South Park.
Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Having the main characters or hosts of the show pitch the product helped lend credibility to the otherwise repetitive ad copy. And that's why I'd like to talk to you about CuriosityStream. Here on Knowing Better, we've always tried to emphasize the value of continuing your education. So when we tell you that there's no better place to do that than CuriosityStream, you know we're telling you the truth. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and nonfiction titles that you can access across multiple platforms. If you're like me, all this talk about cancer probably has you terrified that you'll end up with it. So make sure to check out How Not to Get Cancer, a documentary featuring an oncologist talking about various lifestyle changes you can make to reduce your risk.
Smoking is still the leading preventable cause of cancer.
He definitely talks about more than just smoking, but if you're not in the mood to be preached at about your health, they also have this documentary about camels. The animals, not the cigarettes. You need to broaden your interests and learn about more than just tobacco, which you can do over at curiositystream.com/knowingbetter, where you can also get access to Nebula, the streaming service built by fellow creators to escape the overreaching regulations of the algorithm. Every Knowing Better video is hosted there ad-free. A few of them even include extra content that can only be seen on Nebula. I've also hosted a South Park episode of Working Titles. I've been a fan of the show since the beginning, and that becomes relevant later in this video. Check it out by heading over to curiositystream.com/knowingbetter, where we've worked out a deal to get you both CuriosityStream and Nebula for only $14.79 a year. Remember that deal and sign up for CuriosityStream and Nebula. You'll also be supporting the channel when you do. You're going to sign up for CuriosityStream and Nebula. You're going to do it. Tomorrow. This period of broadcast television ended in 1959, when it was revealed that several advertisers were rigging their quiz shows in an effort to increase ratings. Following the scandal, the FCC handed responsibility for programming over to the broadcasters. Companies were now forced to buy advertising time slots, which were spread out during the runtime of various shows, which were now produced by the networks themselves. This is when the modern age of commercials began. You've hopefully seen a few during this video. Cigarettes are what we call an undifferentiated product. They're all made the same way with the same ingredients. Some smokers will tell you they can taste a difference, but whatever. It's a lot like coffee or cola. Most people can't really tell them apart. So aside from having gimmick filters, the only way to differentiate your cigarettes from all the others was by defining who you were selling them to. This is when the industry shifted away from buckshot advertising and adopted a more targeted approach. Some brands were marketed towards yuppie white people, like Newports, and Virginia Slims were advertised to women, causing Rose Cipolloni to briefly switch to them in the 60s. Marlboro was actually the first brand to be exclusively marketed to women when it was introduced in the 1920s. Marlboro Reds were originally sold with a red tip so that lipstick would be less noticeable. Nowadays everyone uses a tan color, but it serves the same purpose. In the 1950s, Marlboro began to pivot their marketing towards hard-working blue-collar cowboys.
Then there's this flip-top box. I like things that are well designed. This box is interesting and practical.
Philip Morris began their Marlboro Man advertisements in 1954, but just like Barbie, he had a hard time holding down a job and ended up doing everything from serving in the Navy to playing football. It would take almost a decade before he finally settled on being the iconic cowboy. In 1957, the Surgeon General put together an advisory committee to analyze smoking's effect on health and come up with policies to combat the issue. The next year, the Tobacco Institute was founded as a trade association and lobbying group for the industry, separate from the supposedly independent research committee. Their main task was to preemptively fight the regulatory efforts they soon expected from the government. The Surgeon General released his report on smoking and health in 1964, stating that the death rate for lung cancer was 1,000% higher for smokers than non-smokers, and connected cigarettes to a rise in chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and heart disease. Their primary recommendation was that a warning label be printed on every pack.
I'm sorry, I just don't see the point in a warning label for something people already know.
The Tobacco Institute initially lobbied against the label and delayed it for several years. But then they realized that this would grant them legal liability protection. You wouldn't be able to sue them if you developed lung cancer because you knew the risks.
When Congress passed an act forcing all tobacco companies to put the Surgeon General's warning on their packages. So now everyone knows the dangers of smoking. And some people still choose to do it, and we believe that's what being an American is all about.
The warning label appeared on packs in 1966, and within a year, the FTC determined that it had no effect on the sale of cigarettes. Only 3% of consumers even read it. They eventually beefed up the language and printed it in the name of the Surgeon General, also to little effect. But this made smoking a controversial issue of public importance, so the FCC applied the Fairness Doctrine and ruled that if broadcasters wanted to keep tobacco ads on their network, they would also have to give equal time to the opposing view. For every 3 cigarette commercials, they had to show 1 anti-smoking public service announcement.
This is a smoking machine. It is used to test the nicotine and tar content of various brands of cigarettes.
Just a quick clarification here, when we talk about the tar content in cigarettes, we're not talking about the petroleum tar they use in asphalt. Tar is just the residue left behind after burning something. For any other drug, we would call it resin.
This is a smoking machine too, although he probably doesn't realize it. His lungs are also collecting tars and nicotine. One thing about this machine, it will never get heart disease or cancer from smoking. Can this machine make the same claim?
The tobacco industry was the largest advertiser on television, buying up 8% of all available ad time. So thanks to the Fairness Doctrine, anti-smoking PSAs were getting just over 2% for free. Over the next 3 years, per capita consumption of cigarettes began to fall for the first time ever. Big Tobacco quickly realized that the more advertisements they put on TV, the more people would be exposed to the anti-smoking message. So they went to Washington, D.C. to ask for a law to ban cigarette commercials. They needed an act of Congress because this needed to be industry-wide. If any single brand continued to run commercials, they would gobble up the market and keep those PSAs on the air. Big Tobacco got what they wanted, and Nixon signed the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act into law. The last cigarette commercial on television aired during the Johnny Carson Show at 11:59 p.m. on January 1st, 1971. That historic final spot was produced by the female-oriented brand Virginia Slims, which went full circle to reference both the suffragettes and the women's liberation movement.
You got Virginia Slims now, baby. You come a long, long way.
This may seem counterintuitive, but like the warning label, this ban actually helped the industry. Without the mass exposure of commercials, it was nearly impossible for any startup companies to gain a foothold in the market, which protected the already established brands. This ban affected both television and radio, which tended towards a white audience. Black people, on the other hand, tended... Here we go, yet another Knowing Better video about race. Without television or radio, tobacco companies were relegated to advertising in print magazines, which tended towards a black audience, or on billboards and public transportation, which were concentrated in black communities. During the era of white flight in the 50s and 60s, white people moved out of the cities and into the suburbs, most of which made outdoor advertising illegal. As a result, black neighborhoods in St. Louis, Missouri had 3 times as many billboards as white neighborhoods. Menthols made up 27% of the cigarette market in the late 70s because everyone was smoking them. Black, white, male, female, adults, and especially children. But the visibility of menthol billboards in black communities began to create a negative association in the minds of white people. Black people did not switch to menthols. They were already smoking them. It was white people who abandoned them.
Black people! Why do black people love menthols so much?
They don't. Most menthol smokers to this day are white. That stereotype is a direct result of how cigarettes were marketed in the 70s and 80s. Though, yes, today, most black smokers do prefer menthols. Because just like the suffragettes and women's lib, tobacco companies were quick to lend their money and support to the civil rights movement, seeing it as a way to break into another minority market. Tobacco became a major funder of the NAACP and several other black organizations. Kool sponsored urban jazz festivals in 20 different cities as part of a major marketing campaign in 1981, involving hundreds of newspapers and magazines and tens of thousands of billboard and transport ads. Many black-owned businesses and publications began to rely on that advertising revenue. So whenever there was a push to ban billboard or print advertising for cigarettes, black community leaders, business owners, and civil rights groups came out in support of big tobacco. This targeted cultivation of a market for menthols is what turned them into a black thing. During the mildly racist Reagan years, anything having to do with black culture was seen as bad, so white kids stopped picking up Kool as their first cigarette. Instead, they were turning to other established brands like Marlboro or Camel. In 1986, only 30% of adults were regular smokers. Millions had either quit or died, so tobacco companies began devising ways to create what they literally called replacement smokers. Camel's answer to this problem was their new cartoon mascot, Joe Camel, introduced in 1987. I remember Joe Camel. He was the ultra-cool anti-authority spokesbeast who always wore a leather jacket and did all the adult things I hope to do one day. And that was the point. Just like Kool's Willie the Penguin, he was specifically designed to appeal to children. The researchers who ran market testing for R.J. Reynolds even warned them that he may be too appealing to young children, which may cause trouble down the line. In 1991, a study found that Joe Camel was just as recognizable to preschoolers as Mickey Mouse. Within just a few years, Camel's market share among teenagers and young adults more than tripled, and 36% of high schoolers were smoking. They had hooked yet another generation. The first Surgeon General's report to mention secondhand smoke came out in 1972. They referred to it as passive smoking. It's also known as side stream smoke, involuntary smoke, and environmental tobacco smoke. Rather quickly, Arizona became the first state to ban smoking in public spaces, like theaters, libraries, and schools. Minnesota's law a few years later was even more restrictive, banning smoking in all public areas unless specifically allowed, and mandating the creation of smoking sections in restaurants. Within just a few years, 36 states and 20% of businesses had restrictions on smoking. In 1981, a research institute in Tokyo concluded a 16-year-long study of 250,000 people, including the non-smoking wives of smoking husbands. They found an increase in lung cancer and a dose-response relationship. A few years later, the National Academy of Sciences issued a report stating that due to side stream smoke, the children of smokers were twice as likely to suffer from respiratory illnesses. The Surgeon General released a report in 1986 attributing 3,000 annual deaths to secondhand smoke. In an effort to encourage people to quit, the American Cancer Society began the Great American Smokeout in 1976, and 1 million people dropped the habit for a day. The event was so successful, they've held it on the third Thursday of November every year since. But after a decade of enduring public smoking bans and people quitting in droves, Philip Morris decided to fight back and produced the Great American Smokers Kit. It included pins, stickers, signs, and a copy of the Smoker's Bill of Rights.
As a smoker, I am entitled to certain inalienable rights. Among them, the right to the pursuit of happiness, the right to choose to smoke, the right to enjoy a traditional American custom, the right to be treated courteously, the right to accommodation in the workplace, the right to accommodation in public places, the right to unrestricted access to commercial information about products, the right to purchase products without excessive taxation, the right to freedom from unnecessary government intrusion.
This was the beginning of the smokers' rights movement, brought to you by Philip Morris. Big Tobacco wanted to cast their customers as second-class citizens, segregated from society for enjoying a great American pastime. They funded grassroots organizations and tried to link public smoking bans and regulations with the overreaching paternalistic government of the Prohibition era. Rose Cipollone developed smoker's cough, and in 1974, her doctor suggested she try the low-tar, low-nicotine cigarette named True. Several brands were coming out with light versions around this time. This wasn't any better though. She developed cancer in 1981 and had to have her entire right lung removed. She sued the tobacco industry for medical expenses and damages, but died on October 21st, 1984, at the age of 58. Her family would continue the lawsuit on her behalf. Tobacco companies were no strangers to liability lawsuits, having defeated over 300 of them since the 50s. One of their favorite tactics was to overwhelm their opposition with so many documents and internal memos that they could never sort through them all, which is exactly what they did to the Cipollone family. But in this case, the judge decided to release all 300,000 discovery documents to the public in July 1985. Her case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1992, and they decided that the lawsuit could proceed, but could only focus on the period before the warning label was added. This left the door wide open for basically anyone to sue the tobacco companies for damages. Science magazine published a study showing that the air in bars, restaurants, and bowling alleys was so polluted by environmental tobacco smoke that it contained more carcinogens than you would find in a Coke oven. The cabin air quality on airplanes was so bad that it would violate most building codes in the United States. The Civil Aeronautics Board mandated the creation of segregated seating for smokers in 1973, but most people ignored that. They'd buy a non-smoking ticket and then just stand in the back. And having a smoking section on an airplane makes about as much sense as having a peeing section in a swimming pool. So in 1990, they banned smoking on all domestic flights under 6 hours, which is most of them. This was widely seen as a positive change by consumers, despite pushback from the tobacco industry. 2/3 of non-smokers and half of all smokers believe that secondhand smoke was bad for you. It's at this point that the EPA decided the science was robust enough to declare secondhand smoke a Class A human carcinogen, with a report released in December 1992. This made just about every business the target of a potential liability lawsuit. If your employer exposed you to a known carcinogen during the course of your work, say in a bar or restaurant, they could be at fault if you develop cancer. In the 3 years between 1994 and 1997, more tobacco-related lawsuits were filed than in the previous 30 years. Perhaps the most notable of these was filed by Norma Broin, a flight attendant who never smoked a day in her life but developed cancer and had a lung removed in 1989. It soon became a class action lawsuit on behalf of 60,000 flight attendants. In the wake of growing controversy, Philip Morris settled the suit for $300 million in October 1997, making this the first actual payout in tobacco litigation history. Because of the millions of discovery documents from those cases, all of which are still available online, the American people learned that big tobacco knew cigarettes caused lung cancer in 1946. They knew exactly what carcinogens were in tobacco smoke in 1959, and that 85% of those carcinogens were present in secondhand smoke. This completely contradicted the no proof narrative being pushed by Turk and the Tobacco Institute, who had now also been exposed as a sham by these internal memos. What else was the industry lying about? What else did they know? In April 1994, Representative Henry Waxman decided to find out by holding hearings as the chair of the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment. A parody of these hearings was a major plot point in the 2005 movie Thank You for Smoking. He called the CEOs of all 7 major tobacco companies to testify. Since they could no longer claim that there wasn't enough evidence to link cigarettes and secondhand smoke with lung cancer, they had to shift their strategy.
Yes or no? Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no. And again, time is short. If you could just, I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
This was just All around bad for the tobacco industry. Soon afterwards, several former executives and research scientists came forward to testify and directly refuted the claims being made by the CEOs. One such scientist was Victor DeNoble, who had been hired by Philip Morris in 1980 to look into a chemical alternative to nicotine, known as an analog. He did this by experimenting on rats, which is perfect because they aren't susceptible to peer pressure, they aren't influenced by advertising or product placement, and they shouldn't really have any diet goals. The only reason a rat would dose themselves with nicotine was for the chemical pleasure. At first, the rats were only going for it 2 or 3 times a day, but within 3 weeks, they were pressing that lever over 90 times a day. Now that he established a baseline for addiction, he needed to find a nicotine analog that worked just as well. What he came up with was a combination of 2'-methyl nicotine and a compound known as acetaldehyde. This combination was so strong that the rats were dosing themselves 540 times a day. He presented his findings to Philip Morris in 1982, and they immediately rejected them because replacing the active ingredient in cigarettes would require them to seek FDA approval, which they knew they would never get. But acetaldehyde already occurs naturally in tobacco smoke. DeNoble's research had identified it as an impact booster that worked just as well on regular nicotine, so cigarette manufacturers began adding more of it to their product to make it even more addictive.
But we do not do anything to hook smokers or to keep them hooked. Let me repeat. We do not manipulate nicotine to addict smokers. We no more manipulate nicotine in cigarettes than coffee manufacturers manipulate caffeine in their products.
Okay, so first of all, decaf coffee was invented in 1905. Coffee makers have been manipulating it ever since. And second,
while not spiking nicotine, they clearly manipulated. I believe he perjured himself because I watched those testimonies very carefully.
All of us did. There was the whole line of people, the whole line of CEOs up there, all swearing.
This is Jeffrey Wigand, a former executive and researcher at Brown & Williamson who went on primetime TV to confirm just about everything from the Waxman hearings. This interview was later dramatized almost word for word by the 1999 movie The Insider.
You know, we're in a nicotine delivery business.
And that's what cigarettes are for.
Most certainly. It's a delivery device for nicotine.
A delivery device for nicotine.
Delivery device for nicotine.
A delivery device for nicotine. Put it in your mouth, light it up, and you're going to get your fix.
You're going to get your fix.
And you're going to get your fix.
You're going to get your fix.
Like the Reader's Digest article, it's hard to understate just how important this revelation was to the history of tobacco. For almost a century, they had successfully avoided every attempt to regulate their industry by claiming they were selling a lifestyle product. It wasn't a drug, they didn't manipulate it, it didn't cause cancer, and it wasn't addictive. Whistleblowers like DeNoble and Wigand had completely destroyed that narrative. Unfortunately, the Waxman hearings went nowhere. The Republicans took control of the House a few months later, and none of the CEOs were charged with perjury. The Attorney General of Mississippi was the only reason the tobacco companies suffered any consequences. Less than a month after the hearings, he filed a lawsuit on behalf of the state to recover all the tobacco-related healthcare costs they paid through Medicaid. He thought the warning label was no longer sufficient liability protection. The Surgeon General issued a report in 1988 stating that nicotine is an addictive drug. Previous reports had only referred to cigarettes as habit-forming. The packaging and label didn't mention that, so consumers couldn't make an informed choice. Before it was added to every pack, the industry knew cigarettes were addictive and caused lung cancer. They knew exactly how to manipulate nicotine levels and even remove carcinogens. They just didn't. Several companies held patents for a safer cigarette, but never brought them to market, because doing so would be an implied admission that their original product was unsafe. Which, you know, it was. Within 3 years, 30 states had signed on to Mississippi's case, and several others had filed their own independent lawsuits.
This idea now that the government is suing the tobacco companies, this is a betrayal worthy of Sammy the Bull. I mean...
The 90s were an interesting time for supposedly frivolous lawsuits in the United States. The McDonald's hot coffee thing had just happened, which was a totally justified case, but that's not how it was presented in the media at the time. Most Americans had adopted a sort of meh attitude towards corporate liability lawsuits, which is exactly what corporations and right-wing think tanks wanted so they could pass tort reform.
Do you know that the first payment went out recently to someone who sued the tobacco companies after the warning label appeared on the pack, after she started smoking? But it didn't mention her by name. You see, that was...
Haha, what a funny joke! Right up until you realize he's probably talking about Rose Cipollone. In the midst of all these lawsuits, Big Tobacco realized that rather than continue to fight individual cases, they could just reach a settlement with the states, which would cover everyone. They'd write one big check and issue one blanket apology, and that would be the end of it. In June of 1997, they reached an agreement to pay $365 billion to the states over the next 25 years, and give FDA the authority to regulate tobacco. That last part required an act of Congress, which was controlled by the Republicans, so it was voted down. The Master Settlement Agreement, or MSA, was signed in November 1998, significantly reducing the financial penalty and leaving out FDA oversight.
Within a few months, the cigarette companies settled with the American smokers to the tune of $246 billion. And the Academy of Tobacco Studies was permanently dismantled.
The Academy of Tobacco Studies was the movie stand-in for the Tobacco Institute and Turk, both of which were dissolved by this agreement. And that $246 billion was over the course of 25 years. They're actually still paying that off. That money was supposed to be used to help fund public health initiatives and anti-tobacco education, but most states just used it to balance their budgets, making them somewhat dependent on the tobacco industry's continued success. The MSA also ended all outdoor advertising for cigarettes, including billboards and public transportation, meaning that Big Tobacco is the only industry in the country to have lost access to all forms of media. They're the only ones who can't advertise on TV, radio, the internet, or outside. They could no longer sell branded merch through their coupon programs, and they had to get rid of all of their famous characters. I think it's important to note here that none of these penalties were the result of government regulation. The Master Settlement Agreement was an out-of-court legal settlement between the tobacco industry and several individual states, not the federal government.
The other way the government pretends to be caring and discouraging is they attack the advertising, the root of the problem. You know, the Marlboro Man had to come down. He was too powerful. That was just... Joe Camel had to go. The Budweiser Frogs were too powerful an image to people. Hey, even if you are a kid, if you can't resist a frog, I hope you die, and I want you to die. I mean...
We're finally at the point where I was old enough to pay attention to politics and watch edgy comedy specials on HBO. I know, right? We finally get to talk about me. Only took like an hour. I remembered that Joe Camel joke specifically, and I wanted to watch the entire special as part of my research for this video. It's actually quite difficult to find. HBO seems to have scrubbed it from the internet, and when I finally got a chance to see it, I quickly understood why. Of the 1 hour runtime, the first 25 minutes are an unbroken libertarian defense of the tobacco industry. Bruh. Bill Maher is not a libertarian. He's a liberal like you. Okay, first of all, I'm not really a liberal, but second, nobody on the left would agree that he's on the left. He might have voted for a Democrat or two, but he's never been on the left. You're just saying that because he makes fun of you for being woke. Can you help me out here?
I'll clue you in a secret. Death is not the worst thing that could happen to you. It's not worse than losing your freedom. It's not worse than losing a sense of personal responsibility. Now, I'm a libertarian. That means I'm against the government doing almost anything.
What I'm saying is, it's not like he turned into a centrist recently. He's always been... What? It's allowed now. Okay, you're a libertarian, and this is my private property. Well, actually, it's my landlord's property, and I don't want to lose my security deposit, so still, you can't smoke in here. Fascist. Okay, so when I was a teenager, I was also a centrist libertarian. It wasn't like I examined all the political philosophies out there and picked the best one. I just watched a lot of TV shows which frame their political message as common sense, and I absorbed that. It's no secret on this channel that I'm a huge fan of South Park. I was alive when Beavis and Butthead was canceled, so South Park was the new naughty show that we weren't supposed to be watching. And I was hooked from the beginning. So I get really confused when people say that they liked South Park before it got political. You should probably go back and watch those earlier seasons because they were definitely pushing an agenda. They just portrayed it as, obviously this is the way it should be.
You just hate hate smoking, so you use all your money and power to force others to think like you. And that's called fascism, you tubby asshole.
God damn it, don't be no more smoking!
It wasn't the tobacco company's fault that we smoked. It was our fault, us. We should all take personal responsibility instead of letting fat fascists like him tell us what to do.
Most episodes of South Park have a libertarian political slant to them. They're pro-corporations like Walmart and Starbucks. They repeatedly denied global warming. They think addiction is a personal moral failing rather than a disease. And they think secondhand smoke is a myth.
We go state to state and do things like use bogus studies and make expensive commercials to get the public on our side and force cigarette smokers to stop.
Another show that helped form my budding political ideology was Penn and Teller's Bullshit, an educational comedy from the early 2000s. Like South Park, it didn't overtly push politics. It was presented as common sense. They used to debunk psychics, UFOs, the Bible, all stuff that made me feel super smart as a teenager. But they also did an episode on secondhand smoke.
These folks are going to pretend that secondhand smoke is terrible for you and that science has shown this as undeniable fact. Not even close. Laws are being passed, businesses are being forced to shut down, and not one study anywhere offers conclusive proof that breathing in secondhand smoke causes cancer.
Like South Park, if you grew up liking this show, you should probably go back and watch it. The recycling episode was always memorable to me, but rather than expose it as a scam, the message is more about how many bins will the government make us sort through? Penn and Teller are card-carrying libertarians, and that definitely comes through in the show. They also have episodes railing against the Endangered Species Act, feminism, political correctness, diversity requirements, and global warming. And most of the episodes follow this same formula. They find one person arguing for the ridiculous thing, and they portray them in a comedic way.
We guess the government isn't interfering enough in Joe's life. He wants a full-time babysitter.
And then they bring on some academic scholars to back up their side.
Larry Elder, talk show host.
And future Fox News contributor.
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Whelan, and I'm president of the American Council on Science and Health.
The American Council on Science and Health is a lobbying group funded by the pharmaceutical, chemical, and tobacco industries.
I'm Bob Levy, senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute.
The Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank. Notice how they didn't have a single doctor, scientist, or public health official on the show to discuss whether secondhand smoke is harmful. But that won't stop them from debunking the science.
The study that gets the most publicity is a study by the Environmental Protection Agency that was released in 1993, and that study was the catalyst that opened the doors for lots of places to initiate bans on indoor smoking.
This is the report which declared secondhand smoke a carcinogen, which came out in 1992, not 1993. Something you would know if you read the first page of the paper they're showing on screen. It's odd that they would pick this one study and not the numerous reports by the Surgeon General discussing the hazards of secondhand smoke. Now, there's a rumor going around the internet that Penn and Teller made a correction episode where they took back this opinion and fixed a few other mistakes. I own every season on DVD, and I can assure you they didn't. You're probably thinking of Adam Ruins Everything. The closest thing I was able to find was this Google Talk in 2015, where someone asks them if they would take back the secondhand smoke episode.
We certainly say that the science on the dangers of secondhand smoke is not robust, which at the time it was not. We were accurate at the time. Now the studies have come out and they seem much more robust. But it was all couched in, should the government have control over this? In other words, do you have a right to do something to yourself that's dangerous?
The science was absolutely robust when they made that episode in 2003. They were not correct at the time. This was a pathetic attempt to save face. And the issue with secondhand smoke is not that you have the right to do something to yourself that's dangerous. It's something you're exposing others to. Believing secondhand smoke was a myth was just the 90s version of being an anti-masker. This isn't about you. I don't care what you put in your body. This is about protecting everyone else from a known harm. By the early 2000s, any city or state that didn't have public smoking bans quickly enacted them. It's at this point that libertarians picked up the cigarette as a symbol of personal responsibility, and we started seeing supposedly centrist comedy shows push that narrative. Yes, Ayn Rand was a chain smoker, but even back then, her followers considered that to be a weird take. It was the one thing she was wrong about that her fans decided to overlook, kind of like South Park on climate change or Penn and Teller on secondhand smoke. Or Bill Maher and his take on vaccines. Look man, I'm not usually one to resort to violence, but I really don't know how else to explain to you that you can't fucking smoke in here. Relax, bruh. It's just water vapor. Oh God. Oh. Yep, you knew you were gonna have to talk about vaping. Come on. Have fun writing another 5 minutes of content or whatever. The tobacco industry had been trying to invent a non-combustible or self-extinguishing cigarette for decades because smoking was responsible for 30% of all fire-related deaths. People were falling asleep with a cigarette in their hand and then lighting their furniture on fire. In 1989, Big Tobacco hired a man named Peter Sparber to organize the National Association of State Fire Marshals, specifically to shift blame away from the ignition source and towards the fuel. Cigarettes are the reason we have smoke detectors, flame-retardant chemicals, and those giant tags on our mattresses. Throughout the 1990s, there were several attempts to bring a cigarette that was heated rather than burned to market, but they could never seem to get FDA approval. In 2003, a Chinese man named Han Lik invented the modern electronic cigarette as a way for people to quit smoking. The first smoking cessation tool to be approved in the US was Nicorette gum in 1984. After that, there was an explosion of similar products, including patches, lozenges, nasal sprays, and prescription medications. But none of those had the appeal of inhaling and exhaling clouds of stuff. In 2009, Obama signed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, finally giving the FDA authority to regulate tobacco as a drug. The industry had successfully evaded every attempt at oversight since the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This law also banned flavored tobacco products, which were just starting to become popular. There were cigarettes flavored with chocolate, mocha, cherry, berry, and even Caribbean chill, whatever that is. Curiously, menthols were left off that list, probably because they currently make up 30% of the overall cigarette market. Those early e-cigarettes delivered a tiny fraction of the amount of nicotine you would get from a real cigarette, so they were legitimately used as a smoking cessation tool. But also in 2009, someone figured out how to add flavors to the e-liquid, and their popularity exploded. Because of all the public smoking bans that had been passed, many people began switching to e-cigarettes to get around the rules. That lasted 2 years. Then the FDA declared them a tobacco product, and they were regulated in the same way as cigarettes. All that changed in 2015 when Juul was founded and they transformed the product from a dorky e-cigarette to a cool hipster vape pen. It looks like a USB thumb drive with a disposable cartridge full of flavored liquid. Unlike previous e-cigarettes, Juul vape pods feature a combination of nicotine salt and benzoic acid, which acts as an impact booster, delivering the same amount of nicotine as a cigarette. Each pod is designed to contain the equivalent amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. Juul aggressively marketed their product on social media with the hashtag vaporized and featured young adult models doing all of the things that had been banned for cigarette advertising decades ago. They even bought ad space on websites for 17 Magazine, Cartoon Network, and Nick Jr. Do you guys remember Face? They were immediately accused of targeting children because obviously. They ended the campaign, but just like every other time the tobacco industry did something like this, the damage was already done. Millions of high schoolers were vaping up to a pod a day, and 63% of them had no idea it contained nicotine. Vaping is bad for you, okay? But it's less bad for you than smoking. So if you went from smoking to vaping, great, I'm all about harm reduction. But you are not the target customer for vaping, and you haven't been for a long time. The small number of people who vape as a smoking cessation tool provide the industry cover for their more sinister target, which is first-time nicotine users, which, as we've seen repeatedly throughout this story, means children. In 2018, Philip Morris bought a 35% stake in Juul, which then shut down its social media accounts and discontinued the cucumber, mango, creme, and fruit-flavored pods. Now the only available flavors are Virginia tobacco, classic tobacco, mint, and menthol. Every other country that has banned flavored tobacco products, whether that be cigarettes, cigars, or vape liquid, have included menthol on that list. The United States is the only country who hasn't, because we're the only country where menthols are seen as a black thing. The FDA announced their intention to ban menthols in November 2018, and it was a pretty big deal to see the NAACP finally flip to endorse that effort. Several cities and states decided not to wait and moved to ban them independently. San Francisco had already banned them, and Massachusetts became the first state to do so in 2020. But when New York City tried to enact a similar law, they ran into opposition from black civic leaders like Al Sharpton.
If we're talking health, why aren't we banning all cigarettes? Oh, only where it's disproportionately black. So in other words, whites have the intelligence to decide what to smoke, but you've got to, in many ways, make decisions for us.
He's been defending menthols using those racist self-determination talking points for decades. But with this recent push, he began to, rather distastefully, invoke the deaths of Eric Garner and George Floyd, both of whom were killed by police in situations involving cigarettes.
So we're gonna go act like Eric Garner didn't happen, cause a situation where it could happen again, where someone's selling loosies, you end up with a police interaction.
If ban the menthols, it's going to accelerate selling loosies. They sell loosies anyway now. It's going to go 10 times higher. Because y'all know y'all going to go find a way to get y'all's Newports.
Al Sharpton's National Action Network is funded in part by R.J. Reynolds, owner of Newports. This isn't about criminalizing a black behavior because, as I said earlier, most menthol smokers aren't black, they're white, and mostly underage. Since the cigarette was invented, they've been targeting children. I'm not all that big on protecting the kids or anything, but there's actually a very small window where someone can develop a nicotine addiction, and that's between the teenage and young adult years. 95% of adult smokers in the US report having started before they were 21. The tobacco industry's marketing efforts have always kept children in mind. Baseball cards were included in every pack specifically to keep young boys interested in smoking. Menthol was initially added to combat throat irritation, but quickly became an extremely popular entry-level cigarette. 39% of current middle and high school smokers use mentholated cigarettes, and 28% of teenagers who vape use menthol-flavored cartridges. 52% of adult smokers reported that their first cigarette was a menthol. That includes 44% of white smokers. This isn't just a black thing. When Kool introduced Willie the Penguin, they combined menthol with a cartoon mascot specifically designed to appeal to children, just like Joe Camel decades later. Oh, and bubblegum cigarettes? They still exist. You just can't find them at the gas station anymore. You have to go to a novelty candy store or buy them online. Nicotine is an addictive drug, and millions of Americans are permanently addicted. 1 in 10 people who try to quit actually succeed. If you started during that teenage young adult window, you're probably hooked at this point. So banning them outright isn't really a viable option, as much as it pains me to say. Just a few days before filming this video, the FDA announced that they were going to reduce and limit the amount of nicotine in cigarettes to make them less addictive, and that will probably help discourage new smokers from picking up the habit. But people who are already addicted might end up smoking more to get that same buzz, and it's the tar content in cigarettes that leads to cancer and disease. They also banned Juul entirely, though I'm sure Philip Morris will fight that. I understand the punitive reasons for doing that, but I kind of think the cat is out of the bag at this point. Vaping is here to stay. There are several other e-cigarette brands that will be happy to fill the void. Many people have suggested laws to tie the smoking age to a specific year. Nobody born after that will be able to buy cigarettes, so eventually all smokers will die off. But that would take decades, and I don't really want to wait that long. Most other developed countries have enacted plain packaging laws or required gruesome warning labels to be placed on every pack. But America really clings to its trademark rights, so that might be a tough sell. That was what the parody hearings were about in Thank You for Smoking. Part of me wonders if they were priming their audience to think that was a ridiculous idea. At the very least, I agree with the FDA that we should ban all flavors including menthol, which most other countries have already done. That stuff has always been a way to get children to start smoking. Will it create an underground market? I mean, sure, maybe. But I think you overestimate how much effort the average person is willing to put into that. If they can't get it at the store, most people won't bother. They're definitely not going to be doing chemistry in their basement. If you're really that desperate, just suck on a cough drop while you're smoking. You'll get the same effect. I also think we should treat cigarettes the same way we do hard liquor, meaning you can't just get it at the gas station or checkout line at Walmart. You have to get in your car and drive to a special place that sells only that. I assure you, the people who already smoke will be willing to put in that effort. You just have to make it a little harder to start, and you'd be surprised how effective a minor inconvenience can be. When a news website asks you to disable your ad blocker, do you do it? Or do you just nope out completely? Every time there was a new health scare, Big Tobacco would offer up a solution. Oh, you have smoker's cough? Well, here's a menthol. Oh, you're not a fan of the flavor? Well, here's a king size. Uh-oh, you're concerned about getting lung cancer? Here's a filter. Don't worry, it's super effective and safe. Oh, people have learned that cigarettes and secondhand smoke are bad for you? Here's a vape. So the next time they come up with some new gimmick to sell you the same plant insecticide they've been peddling for a century, just remember that tobacco tastes best when the filter's recessed. Parliament, smoke Parliament, cigarettes, no filter feedback. Fuck. All of the cigarettes used on set for this video were fake. Do not smoke or vape. My next 2 videos are one big project and will probably take a while, so just prepare yourself for that. I'd like to give a shout out to my newest Golden Fork patrons, Karen, Am, and Jesspsettle. If you'd like to add your name to this class action, head on over to patreon.com/knowingbetter. Or, for a one-time donation, paypal.me/knowingbetter. Don't forget to light up that subscribe button or the join button if you're a king-size viewer. Check out the merch at knowingbetter.tv, follow me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and join us on the subreddit.